Welcome back to Fans vs. Critics.
We're talking today about specifically Marvel's all-new, all-different campaign in 2015 and David Gabriel's comments from the March 2017 Retailer Summit, in which he claimed that increased diversity in the comics was hurting sales, that specifically that all-new, all-different campaign wasn't working and was driving away old fans. So we want to look today at the role that youth played in this, that is specifically complaints about young readers. So we looked at a lot of online blogs that had discussed this, so things like Bleeding Cool and IO9, but it was also covered in the mainstream press.
The Guardian had an article about it with a lot of comments, a lot of them saying, why are grown-up people worried about comic books?
And yet still covering it, which suggests that it does have mainstream appeal. The quotes that we're going to be speaking to here are ones that were on some of those blogs, on some of those newspaper articles, but also from some YouTube responses that fans made. Speaking of quotes, we have one from Gianco Farino writing for Vice, and he expressed hope that, quote, the lily-white, dude-centric Marvel movies would follow specifically what Marvel Comics has done, but others complained that these diversity efforts alienated what they called, quote, Marvel's core audience, who one commenter, I think it was on the IGN article, defined as, quote, people over 30 and most of them men. And this person added, SJW don't spend money, all they do is bitch.
Because, of course, I've never bought a comic book in my life. So, while this focus on lily-white, dude-centric, and men clearly links that idea of politicization of comics with identity categories like sexuality, gender, and race, what we want to think about here is the role that generation plays in these debates. The reference to true fans as people over 30 rejects all those fans under 30, and so in some ways kind of cuts off the future of comics, because if only Generation X and above read comics,
we're not going to be here forever.
No, we are not. Numerous complaints also focus on the age of the new characters themselves, as seen, for example, in another comment on Sheehan's article on IGN, that Marvel took the characters that worked for years and replaced them with children who suck.
That was italicized by the original poster, children who suck.
So that idea that it's not that Riri Williams is black, it's not that she's female, it's that she's 14.
Yeah.
And a child prodigy.
Which is unheard of in comics.
Completely and totally. So tied in with that, G. Willow Wilson, creator of Ms. Marvel, another one of these young, diverse characters, she argues that this is not really a story about diversity at all. It's a story about the rise of YA comics.
Yeah.
And that's something which got lost a lot in the debates. But we want to look at Comicsgate through an analysis of reactions to specifically The Champions, which began in October 2016 as part of Marvel Now 2.0. The Marvel universe is complicated. Things happen in convoluted ways.
Yep.
So the team of The Champions includes many diverse new characters. And its focus, which is YA heroes engaged openly in political and politicized conflicts, is emblematic of the new Marvel that some fans are rejecting. Recognizing the role of generational conflict, which is both connected to and subsumed within discussions of identity politics. So you can't really talk about kids these days without talking about diversity. So looking at how youth shapes these conflicts can really help critics of all kinds, whether it be fan critics or academic critics or reviewers, understand culture war events such as Comicsgate as something called moral panics, things which we're afraid of what kids these days are doing. So we're going to argue that while nostalgia is used by some fans to express a fear of youth culture, it can also provide opportunities for generational connection. So we're not all going to be saying, look at how bad this is, look at how bad the conflict is. We're also going to be suggesting ways in which we can talk to each other and ways in which the comics and conversations around the comics also do give some sort of hope for intergenerational discussion.
So fear of youth culture, how that's connected to things like diversity and so-called identity politics, and then nostalgia as something that can be a way to express fear, but also a way to create connection. So we're thinking about The Champions. The Champions is interesting. Wasn't necessarily hated as much as some other things are, but it does do that thing where it has a primarily diverse cast of characters, and it's overtly political, and so that's been a sort of flashpoint for a lot of fans. I think it's interesting, the fact that these are comics that are maybe aimed at young people, and that's a problem. A lot of people outside of comics would think that was strange.
Comics are for kids. Comics are a kids' genre. Graphic novels can be for grown-ups. If you're interested in that particular form of storytelling, then you go to graphic novels. You go to the dark and gritty, or even just, Persepolis, something
that doesn't have superheroes, obviously.
Yes.
Fascinating, because I think that definitely for a lot of us, comics was something that we read when we were kids, but in the 80s and 90s, definitely there was an increase in those dark and morally ambiguous characters and themes. And definitely in the 80s, I remember reading Stan Lee saying, we want comics to be read by adults. We want comics to be something that you can carry around and not look down upon. We want, quote unquote, legitimacy, right? So the idea that cultural legitimacy only comes with texts that are aimed at adults, which, by the way, we don't buy into, because of course that would suggest that something like Harry Potter has no cultural legitimacy outside childhood. So this idea that current mainstream comics are explicitly trying to appeal to teenagers and children, we can see how for a lot of comic fans that might feel like a step back.
In fact, it was in the 80s and 90s that the idea of adults who read superhero books, as opposed to adults who read graphic novel, actually saw themselves as a very particular kind of subculture, really grasping for legitimacy. And that hard-fought legitimacy seems to be now under attack.
So we have some quotes here. Joel Rivard wrote a letter to the all-new, all-different Avengers, and he complains that the stories are, quote, cartoony, kiddie, lower quality, in opposition to previous Avengers series, which he describes as, quote, serious, cosmic, grown-up, intelligent sci-fi. It's interesting. He's actually agreeing with elitist dismissals of comics that have taken place over the years to basically suggest that, yes, that was true, and now we're going back to that.
So this dismissal of YA culture and text can't actually be separated from the politics. And it's really, really important to note the champions aren't just young heroes. They're also one of the more diverse superhero teams Marvel's put out. And these newer heroes reflect the changing demographics and also power structures of North America. North America as a whole has an increasing multicultural presence, participation by women at all levels of society, recognition of rights of LGBTQ people. A lot of people don't want that to happen.
Yeah, but so still significant resistance.
Yes, but a lot of the time, youth are leading the change. So cultural change happens because younger people have different attitudes than the older generation. So the very choice to make the champions young meant that they inevitably had to reflect a more diverse group than those found in American superhero teams from the past. Mark Waid, who was the initial writer of the champions, observed, "We'd backed into a superhero team with only one white male on it, and that white male is a mutant," which was an exciting reflection of how inclusive American society is becoming. The founding members include Kamala Khan Ms. Marvel, who is Desi, she's a Muslim American from Jersey City. Miles Morales Spider-Man, who's African American and Latinx. And then Sam Alexander Nova, who is...
He's half Nova.
Yes, but his mother and the family he grows up in is very much a Latinx family, and that's very much part of his identity. You've got Amadeus Cho, Hulk, who's a Korean American, and you've got Viv Vision, who's a synthoid female, daughter of the Vision created by him, and also queer. She says at one point that she sort of searched within herself, and after kissing Amadeus Cho, has decided that an attraction to boys lies nowhere within her. And she's very explicitly exploring what it means to be a sexual being as a synthoid being. And then finally, you've got Scott Summers' Cyclops, who is a white male mutant time traveler displaced from the past, with a genocidal future which he's trying to avoid this time around.
It's pretty diverse. So the makeup of the team definitely reflects changing demographics in America, though we do want to note that just because everybody was white in comics in the past doesn't mean America in the past was white either. We can say that Marvel deliberately constructed the champions in opposition to the older establishment. while Mark Waid says it's accidental that we ended up with this diverse team, it was pretty deliberate to have the young people, the youth as an oppositional identity was pretty deliberate. So the team has its roots in the all-new, all-different Avengers from 2015. Kamala Khan, Sam Alexander, and Miles Morales joined Tony Stark's Iron Man, Sam Wilson's Captain America, Jane Foster's Thor, and Vision. They're all adult characters with long histories, though some had recently taken on mantles of well-loved white male characters, such as poor Jane Foster's Thor. People hated her for taking Thor's name.
A lot of people, not just within the comics but outside the comics, had the "Not My Captain America" for Sam Wilson.
But what's interesting is how much they focus on the team being split along the generational lines. You've got the youngsters all enthusiastic at joining the Avengers, who's with me? And they raise their arms high above their head while the jaded older men barely reach their hands up. So there's this difference in enthusiasm between them, but then
it leads to the young members quitting the Avengers and forming the Champions in the aftermath of Civil War II. A large portion of the events pitted adult heroes against each other in morally gray conflict, and it is that heroes fighting heroes.
Civil War.
Civil War. Camilla complained that all the grown-up heroes broke the world with this dumb war, and they don't seem interested in putting it back together. She proclaims, "We can make people believe in what we stand for again. I bet a lot of heroes our age want that." That reference to heroes our age evokes generational conflict as a key in the formation of the Champions. They provide a meaningful alternative to the adult superheroes, and arguably to the readers that those heroes represent. It's not surprising that some existing fans felt displaced as the target audience. One of the letters to All New, All Different Avengers 8, letter writer called Reman, wrote, "I realized Marvel is after a younger millennial group of fans." He complains, as an old-time fan and collector, it felt like you gave up on us. And in a letter printed in issue 14, Joel Reverd similarly complains, "It seems that Marvel are dismissing older fans and tossing them away with yesterday's trash." A really, really poignant and sad metaphor.
Obviously, any of us who are fans know that antagonism towards in-groups and out-groups and noobs versus the people who are established fans is ongoing. And so there's hierarchies within fandom, so having older fans and younger fans is not really that surprising. But what we think is interesting is, in this case, we want to think about how arguments about a comic's quality, so note again, he's mad that they're aiming it at younger people, but some of the complaints are also, in so doing, you're making a crappy product. So we have to think about how these arguments about a fan's quality and who counts as a quote-unquote true fan can't be separated from normal power struggles that happen all the time in fandom. One of my favorite researchers on fandom, Cornel Sandvoss, he says that, quote, "Researchers have often found it difficult to establish meaningful boundaries between fans and their objects of fandom because the object of fandom is experienced as part of the self." One of the things they noticed is they interview sports fans and they say, "We lost." So it's we're part of that team. There is no separation between me and the team. For these older fans, they do that feeling of being thrown out when it's no longer for them. That can feel like an attack on them.
When Steve Rogers becomes Hydra, we feel like we are becoming Hydra, or we're being told we're Hydra. We are the bad guys. When Tony Stark disappears into a coma, no matter how much we know he's coming back, it feels like we've died.
Yeah, and we all know that feeling of like watching a television show that you love and suddenly it starts turning into something that is pleasing new fans and maybe not you as much. So when Reman complains, "I can't relate to your new heroes," and he states that he looks forward to seeing, quote, "the real Thor, Hulk, Cap," he demonstrates that for many fans, seeing their heroes replaced by younger heroes, we saw this complaint a lot. In almost all of the comment sections, this was the major complaint. They would say, "We don't mind women, we don't mind people of color, we mind that you replaced our heroes." And then thinking about that idea of feeling like you've been thrown away with the trash. So it feels like being personally ejected from this comics universe. So we want to think about that. Like, obviously fans missing their favorite characters is understandable, but the fact that this introduction of new younger characters is presented as an unprecedented event of social engineering and scandal worthy of this title of Comicsgate. This is what we want to talk about. Not that you don't have a right to be upset, but that it is being represented as some kind of political engineering on an unprecedented level is,
well,
it's not true.
It seems wrong-headed is
Yes.
what I was going to say. And it also is very much, that use of gate is really interesting. It started with Gamergate, but gate tends to be used for political scandals. And so it is part of the politicization of cultural critique. We're arguing that nostalgia has been weaponized by some fans as a means of distinguishing between the true, supposedly apolitical comics fans.
So when they say it's about the quality, it's not about the character. One of the claims they're making is that they're being apolitical.
Yes,
Okay.
we just want good storytelling,
Yes.
and as soon as you bring a black person into it, it's about politics, and it's
Yeah.
about their skin color. Or as soon as you bring a woman into it, it's about gender. Or
Yeah.
as soon as you bring a queer character into it, it's about sexuality, and it's political. Whereas white males are neutral.
Or you can have people of color and women, but it shouldn't be about any of those
Yes,
things.
yes,
Which is a
but-
complicated...
Yes, you should never mention.
Yes. And these people, of course, compare themselves to the politically motivated younger fans
Yes.
who are buying supposedly for political reasons.
Yes. I am currently buying the Champions input because it's got an Inuk superhero in it, and I really want to make sure that my local comic book store is getting those texts. So I am buying for political reasons, but I'm also buying because that's the kind of storytelling I want. For example, in terms of this apolitical nature, you have Beth Eldekin's IO9 article, one fan complaining that non-comics fans are symbolically purchasing not because they actually cared about the comics, but because they supported the initiative. So you have people going out and buying a few issues of the all new, all different campaign.
It is, as they say, performative consumerism.
And these people are cast as invaders and pretenders to comics fans. Very much defines them as fake fans and links them to the social justice warriors, that pejorative term, who have become a common bogeyman for all those concerned about quote-unquote political correctness as a direct threat to free speech. On the same article, Joshua Sibley complains that Cap, Thor, Iron Man, etc. survived in a society outright hostile to comics since the 40s. Their exploits have been around so long, they're practically mythology. I'm so tired of these Tumblr kids. Again, that generational idea, and that idea coming in the kids with their new technologies I don't understand, their new ways of storytelling I don't understand. That idea that they're bringing the white liberal academy.
It's this weird combination of like Tumblr kids combined with sociology professors who are politicizing them.
So here you have a lot of interesting things going on. You have the invocation of survival against hostile forces, combined with the valorization of mythological figures with legendary exploits. And one could easily argue that late 20th, early 21st century superheroes are one of the most prevalent mythologies.
Totally.
But again, it's linking the adult comic book fan with a narcissistic projection of power and resilience, aligned against kids who've been indoctrinated by elitist academia.
Yeah, so you can see how that identification here, if you no longer are getting it in the comics, one of the things you do is your identification comes with the group that is fighting against Marvel and the incursion of children into your space, and get power through that identification, right? And through that sort of, I think that's where Comicsgate and seeing it as a battle kind of comes in, that it's about identifying with this group that is fighting for its very survival. So we have another one with this guy, the Fifth Horseman, which also complains, quote, "This all happened because hipsters, millennials, whatever, who never read comics before decided to read them after the movies started coming out. They decide they don't like the status quo and they start chattering at Marvel and DC to change what has worked and replace it with what they think it should look like. That ends up alienating a lot of older readers." So again, there's this whole construction of the younger reader is one who purchases and reads for all these agenda-driven reasons. They're latecomers, they were coming from the movies, they're not real fans, they don't really understand quality of storytelling. Young fans are threats to the cultural object, which in this case is comics, through their rejection of the status quo.
Yeah, the bringing in of the movies there is fascinating to me because the movies have really, in many ways, revitalized Marvel Comics. Because because the Marvel Cinematic Universe doesn't get much bigger in terms of movies at the moment.
No.
That's actually bringing people back to the comics, which is a good thing because it allows them to survive, but becomes threatening to the people who stuck with it when it was a little more niche.
And especially when they start going, well, this Bucky isn't my Bucky. This is the Bucky from the movies, who's now in the comics and sort of has displaced the Bucky from the comics. And Iron Man, he has totally different eye color, right?
Yes, yes. Robert Downey Jr. has brown eyes. Iron Man has blue eyes. It is a legitimate complaint.
It is, and all of this, like, we get where you're coming from. What we would say, this isn't really unprecedented.
No.
It is not unprecedented to see younger characters being introduced, mantles passed over from one to the other. It is not unprecedented to see Marvel Comics being involved in politics.
No, Marvel Comics have been involved in politics since the early 40s at least.
Yeah, so there's your personal emotional reaction of, I used to like something and now it sucks. And then this is part of a larger conspiracy by leftists and SJWs to destroy Western culture.
So you have the vitriol with which some fans are rejecting the young characters and audiences, suggesting that what's really a fear of replacement. And so a lot of the time we have every generation looking at the next one and saying,
kids these days.
That fear of replacement, that's normal. But it's also being accompanied by a disgust toward the young and the effect they're having on culture.
Kids who suck.
The extent to which the debates about changes in Marvel Comics have received widespread media attention and featured lengthy and heated exchanges among fans outlined us versus them in comics fandom. And we see this again and again in culture wars and in society in general. We're becoming an increasingly bifurcated society, and the idea of we're splitting into two teams, whatever those two teams might be, and the other team is always wrong and you have to toe the party line of your team.
If you're familiar with Stanley Cohen's moral panic, these are some of the characteristics he says they have. So that is generally some kind of widespread media attention, which we would argue that the diversity debate, especially the complaints about diversity ruining comics, that actually got really widespread coverage. So a clear outlining of us versus them, and this idea of tapping into fears of a youth culture. As with the vast majority of moral panics, there's this fear about the effect of that youth culture on American culture as a whole. So represented here by this beloved icons of American comics, and these complaints enunciate not just these ageist assumptions about kids these days, but that us and them also does get caught up in racist and sexist rejections of this diversity that characterizes that younger generation, and especially if it's seen as replacing what was perceived as a primarily white male generation.
It's one of the reasons I think that so often college students are portrayed as the epitome of the social justice warrior.
Yeah,
someone who's outside of society and criticizing it without actually being a part of it. On a positive note, the Champions comic and many of its fans do demonstrate that intergenerational relations, while fraught, can also be meaningful, powerful, and positive. For example, while comics does include conflict between older and younger heroes, it also clearly demonstrates that the younger heroes were inspired by and modeled themselves upon the older ones. So the very fact that most of the Champions are replacement. I mean, Ms. Marvel becomes Ms. Marvel because she loved Carol Danvers, and she initially wanted to be Carol Danvers, blonde, leggy, with the butt cheeks hanging out. She quickly changed her look, realizing she had to be true to herself. And so Tony Stark actually refers to Kamala Khan as a fan turned pro. So that idea that she's a fan who's actually become a superhero. So this characterization of fan turned pro is significant, not only because it links Ms. Marvel to the fans reading the comics, but also because fan fiction is a way for fans to both engage with and critique that which they love. And so the Champions, I'd argue, in some ways operates as Avengers fan fiction, saying that, yeah, we love the Avengers, it's awesome. We want to make it happier. We want to make it a little more aimed specifically at doing good. We want to make it less morally gray.
One way that they do it is through activism. So again, this is why some of the angrier fans have seen it as childishly simple or openly SJW. The older heroes have that realistic cynicism, but the complexities of making a difference in the world. But the Champions still feel that they can make a change in the world.
Yeah, they've got youthful idealism, and you need youthful idealism
Yes, you do.
to get change going. So in many ways, that moral clarity of the team echoes the simple good versus evil of comics in their early origin. So you can see good old Captain America, you can see Spider-Man from the 60s there. And like those early texts, it can at times seem just a titch preachy, maybe.
Or simplistic.
Or simplistic. Where you have Marvel superhero civil wars, splitting the heroes along both sides of a relevant political issue, such as registration in the first Civil War or profiling in the second. You have the champions being more likely to come in with the assumption that one side is right.
And originally when I was rating them, that's what I was like, but they're just so morally certain of things.
But they do pick things where moral certainty is
a good
little
thing.
easier.
Yep.
So their first mission, they actually scan and look for places where moral certainty is. So they have Vision look through and say, okay, this is our first mission, which is to save a whole bunch of young girls who are stuck in a container about to be shipped off for sex trafficking.
It's hard to be gray.
Yes.
And it is interesting, right? That they maybe, as a team, specifically go, we're going to pick the things that can be right and wrong. And so that's not saying that there can't be an Avengers and there's only a Champions, but maybe there's a different place for different kinds of comics and different kinds of teams in universe.
This assumption carries over even when they do address more politically divided issues. So, for example, when they confront an anti-Muslim sheriff who's very much anti-immigration, very much a parody of Trump-supporting right-wing, small-town, anti-immigrant, Southwest, Middle America. So you've got him clearly occupying one side of the current culture wars, and the champions are very explicitly critiquing America First politics.
So where I did think the complexity did come in is how they negotiate. What do we do in this situation? Rather than punching the sheriff, which Cap would do, but they instead reason with the people he's influenced. And Mark Waid explains this, the difficulty of that mission. He says, if you've got a bunch of kids that build an app to help drought victims in India, and someone's out to stop that for whatever reason, there's nothing to punch there. But there is global injustice. You're dealing with arms races and international conflicts, especially those involving young people. How do you do that in a way that's effective without suggesting there's simple answers to it? So issue 3 does demonstrate that might mean not being the central heroes. So the champions in that one come to the aid of a group of young Muslim women who are advocating rights to education in their country. But they specifically say to the champions, you can support us, but you can't be seen to fight on our behalf. It will not help us to be seen being rescued. That sends the message to everyone in Lazabad and beyond that Americans will solve everything for them. They go for the simple right versus wrong.
Yeah.
I'll say education is good, sex slavery bad, but it requires nuance to fix it. It doesn't have the punching that maybe earlier comics had.
Yes.
And for those of us who love punching, that can be hard.
Yes, because superheroes have almost always been about punching.
They're very punchy people.
We need to go in and support the people who are working for change in their own countries. So we see a similar complexity in the use of social media in the comic. Just like the politics are complex, so the social media use is complex. It isn't just that kids use their phones all the time.
So it is actually playing into that sort of stereotype of kids these days on their phones, but saying, hey, what if they're doing something with those phones?
The showdown at the end of the first issue, again,
is great with that.
Showing how this superhero team is going to be working through what its focus is going to be, how it's going to be representing itself. So you end with Ms. Marvel making this huge inspirational speech about youth and about how everyone can be a champion. And that speech is shown, filtered through someone filming her on phones with all sorts of other phones around it. And so you have the idea that it's real because it's being filmed, but also it spreads because it's being filmed. And so everyone's a champion because everyone can see this. And the issue ends with the team assessing their social media impact. Basically, they're all staring at their phones.
Even superheroes have to worry about their likes.
And the champions worry about their social media impact. Champions combines the politics with the creating community and marketing.
So we just have a few quotes just to give you a sense of this. Brody Van Zee writes in, I love the idea that anyone who wants to change the world can call themselves a champion. So where is the sign-up sheet? Because I'm like totally joining. We would call this what Megan L. Musgrave terms imaginary activism. For her, that includes, quote, a variety of activities that are depicted in fictional context and designed to instigate real-world discussion, engagement, and activism.
So it is actually suggesting that literature can change the world.
Yeah, and I mean, we do know that there's limits to the hashtag activism, like as happened in the comics.
Yeah, social media activism that the Champions endorse and practice completely blows up in their face when their open source name and brand, which they'd encourage people to use as they see fit, gets co-opted by both their nemesis team, the freelancers, and also by corporate marketing. And so you have these Champions merchandise being sold, which actually happens in real life.
Yeah, it is fascinating because it gets into all sorts of things, right? The idea of putting your ideas out there for free and what happens when they go out there, and are people going to use the inspiration in the way that you want them to? And once you inspire people, do you have control over what they do with that?
And so you have issue 7 beginning with the splash page of their logo thrown in the trash. And the social media, which we'd had at that beginning as lauding them and pumping them up, now allowing disillusioned fans to dogpile on them.
I do think we get from this that, yes, it's an openly optimistic text in many ways. It's certainly geared towards activism more than some other comics, but it also does recognize the pitfalls of that and the limitations of activism. And we get the sense that it's not telling us a very simplistic narrative about these things, but it does remind us that even if their actions aren't perfect, they are a model for how we all struggle as people who want to do good in a world in which it's not that easy to do it.
This younger generation of heroes is not advocating necessarily a specific political viewpoint, but instead hopeful optimism that the world can be changed for the better.
This is a part where I want to break in and just say, we do love comics. Old people love comics. Young people love comics. That love for comics can actually bring people together. And I think comics as a medium, the nostalgia is very crucial to it.
Nostalgia is really important. And that brings us actually to Cyclops, which is really interesting in terms of the Champions version of the Cyclops. Cyclops was the original leader of the original X-Men from way back in the early 60s. So that comic, which spurred a lot of Gen X people's love for the genre.
Yeah.
I know
X-Men was huge in the 90s.
So Cyclops, who was a hero, eventually took, spoiler alert for those of you
a bit of a dark turn.
Yes. He became a genocidal maniac. Tyrannical, got transported from the past to our present. And so what we have here is Cyclops who's young, who hasn't done any of those things, but has that dark future hanging over him and has everyone sort of looking a little bit askance at him. He only shows up in the second issue, and they all sort of have to have a bit of a team meeting to go, do we want future Hitler coming in? And I think Amadeus Cho says that. And Miles Morales argues the adult Cyclops who turned into a villain is dead. This is his kid self, stranded here from the past, trying to make good. And so we'd kind of argue that this is a way of addressing older fans. But maybe you can think back to that kid self who fell in love with comics for the fun, for the idealism.
And we have to say there are some totally adorable letters that do show people doing this. So we've got 50-year-old Alistair Macaulay, his letter to the comic. He encourages the, quote, longtime Marvelites who aren't too happy with some of the newer versions of classic characters and concepts to go ahead and read the Champions. And so he ends with a comparison that links this current title to that nostalgic past of the X-Men at their height that are idealized by so many of us Gen X comics fans. So he says, the biggest compliment I can pay is that this book feels like Claremont and Byrne's X-Men did the first time around. So I love this because he's not using nostalgia as this weapon to cudgel the younger generation. He's employing it as this point of connection. He says there's continuity between my past as a reader and these younger readers' presents. For them, it's going to be the Claremont and Byrne. So his sense of a nostalgia embraces this possibility, at least, of positive change. We have another one. Alan Brown says, and this is to issue number 4. It feels like a book I read back in high school when I enjoyed this medium the most. Another one in issue 13 says, reading Marvel Champions makes me feel like I did when I was a little kid reading comics. Thank you.
So we don't want to throw older readers with different tastes on the scrap heap, and we don't think Marvel does either. As letter writer Eline Boonen Vale puts it, Champions is about empowering young people by overcoming the violence and cynicism that we so often feel trapped by in a world of narrow-minded and defeated adults. That's a letter to issue 6.
We're not saying that we agree with Eli that all adults are narrow-minded and defeatist, but post-Civil War II, we could probably argue that all of the adults in the Marvel Universe certainly were.
Yeah, there was a dark period there, and Secret Empire did not make anything happy at all.
So, I mean, if we think of that, narrow-minded and defeatist adults, obviously a statement like that can be read as an assumption that adulthood is fallen and wrong, and all of us who are older might feel defensive because we don't feel fallen and wrong. But we're arguing that it gives us a chance to reconfigure our idea of what adulthood means, so we can leave behind our own entrapment and baggage, just as Cyclops aims to do, and we have far less baggage than he does. So the value of comics does not have to lie in the genre rejecting youthfulness and optimism, embracing darkness and grittiness. That's a thing that has irritated me for a long time. Real adulthood has to be dark and gritty all the time, and for the love of God, it doesn't have to be. So we were really heartened by a comic that features in the same letters page letters from 5-year-old Dante Carroll, who says, "This is the first comic I have ever subscribed to," and 67-year-old Michael Finnegan, who had been reading comics from the age of 11, and he writes his first letter out of excitement over having a superhero group that actually works. Love that.
Yes. So we believe that a refusal by fans to make space for the next generation, including new characters, new attitudes, new fans, new social norms, is inherently, and by definition, conservative, wanting to conserve the past.
Yes, to say that there's no room for any of these new things, to us that's regressive.
Champions depicts and is primarily aimed at a younger audience, so it is focusing on youth. But it effectively uses nostalgia, not only to encourage all readers to be optimistic, but also to bridge that generation gap and to suggest that one solution to the current culture wars lies in focusing on what we might have in common. We all like comics. Which comics do we like in common and why?
Never assume that there's a good quality to writing and storytelling and that's all there is to it.
And Marvel Champions actually hasn't had a lot of the same backlash.
No, it hasn't.
And one of the things which might be happening with Champions is that it might be sort of the dumping ground for the young characters.
Yeah.
So as Bruce Banner comes back, Amadeus Cho is moving into Champions. And then when Tony Stark comes back, Ironheart joins the Champions. So that idea that these young characters can all just go to the Champions could be a dangerous almost ghettoization.
Rather than that knee-jerk reaction of, I don't like this, therefore it sucks and it's bad art, do you not like it because you're not identifying with it? Maybe it isn't for you and another comic is. Maybe it is for a different diversity, for a different age group. Maybe it's for women. That doesn't mean that there aren't other comics that are for you. They don't have to all be for you and all have to be your taste for it to be okay.
But it is very true. The idea that it's not as though there are no comics aimed at white males. Peter Parker never went away. Tony Stark only disappeared for about 6 months or so.
Thank you for listening, and we'll be back again with more Fans versus Critics. Good night.